All right, hopefully we can finish up chapter 32 in this recording. We are on slide number 30, which gives you some terminology that you need to know related to cardiovascular disease, or CVD. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in most Western countries, which of course includes the United States. When we say that someone has hypertension, that means high blood pressure. 30% of Americans are sufferers of hypertension, and this is caused by the narrowing of arteries due to atherosclerosis. So there's two terms, there's atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis that can get a little confusing. Atherosclerosis is the accumulation of fatty materials or plaque between the inner linings of the arteries. And sometimes you can get a clot, which is called a thrombus, that will form on an arterial wall from that accumulation of fatty materials. Arteriosclerosis is hardening of the arteries, and that can come from atherosclerosis. They can be related. Now, stroke is a disruption of blood supply to the brain, and it results when a cranial arteriole bursts or is blocked by an embolus, or a traveling blood clot, basically. So stroke is when a blood vessel that supplies the brain is blocked, whereas heart attack or myocardial infarction is when a coronary artery that supplies the heart becomes blocked. What a person will experience sometimes during a heart attack and before the heart attack is angina pectoris, which is pain in the chest pain, painful squeezing sensation from myocardial oxygen insufficiency due to partial blockage of a coronary artery. So it's chest pain. It's just another word for chest pain. And the heart attack again is myocardial infarction, which means heart muscle death. Cardial for heart, myo for muscle, infarction for death, heart muscle death. Some of the treatments for heart attack, you can have a stent. That is a self-expanding wire mesh tube that can be inserted into the blocked artery to keep it open. Sometimes stents are unsuccessful, so they will do a coronary bypass, and that is when they replace the artery with a healthy artery or vein from elsewhere in the body, and bypass the blockage, basically make another route for the blood to take. And so that's a little information about cardiovascular disease. This is showing you atherosclerotic plaque. It's showing you what a partially blocked artery looks like. And a stent, first of all, a catheter can be run through that plaque, and then the stent. What we're seeing here is something called balloon angioplasty. And that is when they put a balloon in there and blow the balloon up, and it kind of presses against the plaque and opens up that space in the artery. And then you put the stent in there to keep it open. All right, this last section is on blood. Blood functions in transporting gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients such as glucose and amino acids and fatty acids, waste products like urea, and actually carbon dioxide is a waste product, antibodies, and hormones throughout the body. The blood helps combat pathogenic microorganisms because through the action of the white blood cells. It helps maintain water balance and pH by drawing water into the blood, and those levels can be adjusted by the kidneys and other body systems. Regulates body temperature by dilating and constricting blood vessels. When blood vessels dilate, it helps carry blood to the surface of the skin where heat radiates off the surface of the skin. So dilating blood vessels will help eventually cool the body, and constricting blood vessels will cause the body to hold in heat, so it will warm the body. Blood also carries platelets and platelet factors to help in blood clotting. This is a diagram that shows the composition of the blood. Basically, the blood consists of about 55% plasma and 45% formed elements. So the formed elements include red blood cells or erythrocytes, white blood cells or leukocytes, and platelets or thrombocytes. And actually they're not called, I read this the other day, they're called thrombocytes in all other animals, but in humans we just call them platelets. So plasma consists of about 92% water, and plasma proteins, some of the plasma proteins like albumin helps to maintain the concentration of the blood. The blood concentration, of course, we know blood is thicker than water, so it's thicker than tissue fluid. And that high concentration, a large part is due to all those extra plasma proteins in the blood, and also the formed elements makes the blood thicker, and it causes water to kind of be drawn in, absorbed into blood vessels by osmosis. So water moves toward the more concentrated solution. There are also plasma proteins called globulins, like hemoglobin, that function in transporting oxygen. And there's immunoglobulin, which is another word for antibody that help to fight infections. And then there are plasma proteins called fibrinogen, which function in blood clotting. There are salts dissolved in the blood plasma, like that release ions like sodium and chloride and magnesium and calcium bicarbonate. So we also call them electrolytes. There are gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, dissolved in the blood plasma. There are nutrients like lipids, fatty acids that form from the breakdown of lipids, glucose, which forms from the breakdown of carbohydrates, and amino acids formed from the breakdown of proteins. Then you have waste like urea and uric acid, and you also have hormones. So these are all dissolved in that 92% water. What we're looking at here is a sample of blood that has been centrifuged or spun really fast in a machine called a centrifuge. And the red blood cells and white blood cells form this 45% layer. They're heavier. So they form this red layer here, and the white blood cells form this thin white layer in between the red blood cells and the platelets. The red blood cells and the plasma. And then the plasma will sit on top because it's less dense. All right, the notes on red blood cells, they do not have a nucleus, which is kind of interesting. Red blood cells shed their nucleus when they become mature, and they contain a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin contains iron, and it's the iron that oxygen actually binds to when it's transported in the blood. Red blood cells are manufactured continuously in the bone marrow, the red bone marrow of the skull, ribs, vertebrae, and the ends of long bones. When you don't have enough red blood cells, or your red blood cells don't have enough hemoglobin, or even if you're low in iron, you can have anemia, which is low oxygen to your tissues. The hormone erythropoietin, or EPO, stimulates red blood cell production, and it's actually manufactured by the kidneys. The kidneys produce that whenever a person is anemic. As far as blood typing, blood types are determined by the presence of surface antigens on the red blood cell. So there are antigens, the antigens are called A, B, and RH. So if you have A antigen and RH antigen, then you'd be A positive. If you're blood type A, you're going to have the A antigen on your red blood cells, and in your plasma, you're going to produce antibodies to B. So that means if somebody who's type B, if their blood is donated to you and you're the recipient and you're type A, then you're going to have a transfusion reaction. Your blood's going to start to clot and you could even die. So when you're blood type A, you produce A antigens on the surface of your red blood cells, and you produce antibodies to B in your plasma. If your blood type B, it's the opposite. You produce B antigens and antibodies to A. If your blood type AB, you produce both of those A and B antigens on your red blood cells, so you don't have to make antibodies in your plasma to either one of those. If your blood type O, then you're not going to have any of the A or B antigens on your red blood cells, and you produce antibodies to both of them in your plasma. As far as Rh, if you have Rh antigen on your red blood cells, then you would be called positive. So like A positive or B positive or O positive. But if you don't have Rh antigen, then you'll be A negative or B negative or so on, you know. So antibodies in the plasma can cause a clotting reaction or transfusion reaction. It's called agglutination. These are cross reactions that occur when antigens meet antibodies, and you can have organ damage as a result and even death. This image shows you a type A blood donor, and the recipient is a type A recipient. Okay, so in the plasma of both blood of the donor and the recipient, they're going to produce antibodies to B. But antigens on their red blood cells are only A antigens. So when the blood mixes, the antibodies aren't going to bind to the antigens because these are B antibodies and A antigens, and they don't have a shape that fits. So there's not going to be any agglutination. The blood can easily be transfused or donated from a person with type A to another person with type A, because the recipient with type A is going to have antibodies to B but not to A antigens. All right, this is what's going to happen if you've got a donor who's type A and the recipient is type B. So the recipient is actually going to have antibodies to A, and those antibodies will bind to the A antigens from the donor, and it will cause a clotting reaction, agglutination in the blood of the recipient. Now, something can also happen with newborns. It's called hemolytic disease of the newborn, HDN, and that is when you have a mother who's Rh negative and she has a child who's Rh positive. And actually, because what's going to happen is when that child's blood mixes with hers during labor, it's going to cause her to produce antibodies to the Rh positive child's blood, but the child's already born. So it's really the second Rh positive baby that she has, the subsequent pregnancy with an Rh positive baby, that it would be dangerous because she would have these antibodies built up that would attack the Rh antigens on that baby. So what they do is they give her an immunoglobulin injection called RhoGAM. Usually right after she has the first Rh positive baby, she'll get the injection during the labor, you know, after the baby is born, just right there in the operating room. And that will prevent her from producing antibodies that she will keep in her blood and that will attack the second baby's blood. So, all right, white blood cells. White blood cells or leukocytes. Most are larger than red blood cells. They do have a nucleus. They don't have hemoglobin. They are important in the inflammatory response, which is what happens, our response to infection. We have 5 types. There are 3 that are called granulocytes, granular leukocytes, because they produce granules that you can see under the microscope. They're called neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And then we have the ones that are agranular. They're called monocytes and lymphocytes. So the neutrophils are phagocytes. That means they engulf and digest bacteria. Basophils produce histamine that cause the inflammatory response when you have an infection. Eosinophils are involved, particularly they're involved in fighting parasites, parasitic worms, and allergies. You'll have larger numbers of eosinophils if you have a parasitic infection or if you have allergies. Monocytes are the largest of the white blood cells. They migrate into your tissues and differentiate into macrophages, which means big eaters. They help to fight infection. They release growth factors that increase the production of white blood cells by the bone marrow. So they play a very, very large role in attacking pathogens, and they are phagocytes. So macrophages and neutrophils and eosinophils are phagocytes. Then we have lymphocytes, the T cells and the B cells, and these are the white blood cells that are involved in immunity, in fighting something specific, especially if you've had a vaccine for it or you've built up an immunity to it. T cells and B cells are going to help. B cells actually produce antibodies. But T cells and B cells are involved in the immune response. The rest of the white blood cells fight anything foreign, but lymphocytes fight specific pathogens. Then we have platelets, which are involved in blood clotting. A blood clot consists of platelets, red blood cells, and fibrin, a protein called fibrin, and those just kind of form the clot. And these are the steps of blood clotting. The blood vessel is punctured. The injured tissues attract platelets, which start to form a plug. Then you have fibrin that comes in. These threads kind of weave themselves among the platelets, and they form the blood clot, and the bleeding is stopped. All right, I'm going to try to finish this up in this recording. Capillaries are for exchanging materials with our tissue cells. They're very narrow and tiny, and red blood cells must go through them in single file because they are so tiny. Walls of capillaries are very thin so that nutrients, gases, and waste can diffuse across the walls. Oxygen and nutrients diffuse out of the capillaries into our tissue cells, and then carbon dioxide and waste diffuse into the capillaries from our tissue cells. Another tissue that we have, another fluid that we have in our body is interstitial fluid or tissue fluid, and that fluid is collected into our lymphatic capillaries, and it's called lymph. And lymph is eventually returned to the veins. It enters the subclavian veins near your collarbone, and back to the heart. And we're going to end there.